All right, well, we'll get started here. Today's talk is on the Electoral College, and hopefully everything that you ever thought or wanted to know about the Electoral College, given that this is a presidential election year. We're going to go through all the basics and then talk about how things went last time in 2020 and how things can go down this way in 2024. So I guess we'll start with the basics. You probably know that the qualifications for president are quite few. You just have to be 35 years old, lived in the United States for 14 years, and a citizen of the United States from birth. A lot of people, the whole birther conspiracy that somehow Barack Obama was not eligible to be president of the United States, and that he was, Donald Trump demanded that he show his birth certificate was kind of never really made any sense, because even though Barack Obama did show his birth certificate, having been born in Hawaii, it really wouldn't have mattered where Barack Obama had been born. Even if he had been born in Timbuktu, his mother was an American citizen, he would have been a citizen at birth, and therefore eligible to be president of the United States. Ted Cruz, when he ran for president in 2016, Ted Cruz was born in Canada, but his parents were American citizens, and that's all that was really required. So no other qualifications. We've even had presidential candidates like run from prison. Eugene Debs, socialist, ran from prison during World War I. One wonders how that would work if somebody who was serving time in prison actually won, but hopefully that constitutional crisis is not something we're going to have to deal with in the near term. All right, so the Electoral College, you should, most people, actually I don't know if most people know this, but when you go and vote on election day, in this case next week for president, people and American citizens are not really voting directly for president and vice president, even though that's what shows up on the ballot. If you look closely, you're actually voting for electors to the Electoral College, who will then in turn choose the president and the vice president. It's the only role that the electors themselves have, is to vote for president and vice president. It's not a paid position, it's just an honorary ability, and something that I'd get a lot of honor out of it if I happened to be an elector. I always thought that would be a cool thing to be. But what we're actually choosing is not the president, but actually the electors, in this case, for Michigan. Now, the electors choose both the president and the vice president. How many electors does Michigan have? Currently, we have in Michigan 15 electors. And the reason, or how you would know that, is you would simply add together the number of representatives that Michigan has with the number of senators Michigan has. And so Michigan currently has 13 representatives. We have 2 senators, therefore 15 is the number of electors that Michigan will award this year. Obviously, that can go up or down based on the number of representatives assigned to each state after 10 years. And Michigan, of course, lost a representative last time. And therefore, we lost an elector. In 2020, we had 16 electors. This time, we'll have 15 electors. Now, based on what I just told you, one would conclude logically that there must be 535 electors, because there's 100 senators and there's 435 members of the House of Representatives. So logically, 535 would be the number. But up until 1961, that would have been correct. But in 1961, we ratified the 23rd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And what that did, the 23rd Amendment gave Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, 3 electoral votes in the Electoral College. And that was because millions of people who had lived there had been complaining for years that they never had a chance to vote for president. And apparently the rest of the country became sympathetic enough to ratify the 23rd Amendment in 1961. So since then, we always have to remember to add 3 for Washington, D.C., even though the District of Columbia is not a state. Since it's not a state, it doesn't have any senators, it doesn't have any representatives, but since then it still has 3 electors to the Electoral College. Now, each state, and in the case of the District of Columbia, they would decide how their electors are assigned. Michigan gives all of its electors to one party or the other. Whichever party on election day proves to be the most popular, get the most votes for their candidate, they will get all 15 electors to the Electoral College. Now, you might think, well, for example, in 2020, Joe Biden won all 16 of the electors that we had that year for president. Donald Trump won 0. And that might seem unfair given the fact that millions of people in the state of Michigan voted for Donald Trump. You might think he deserved some electors in the Electoral College, and it seems a reasonable conclusion. And that might be more fair, but Michigan isn't doing it this way to be fair. Michigan's more about being important. And Michigan giving all of its electors, winner take all, to one party or the other makes Michigan more important in the Electoral College. And if you're having trouble imagining that, imagine, well, as we'll have 15 this year, 15 electors, if you're a candidate running for president and you have a choice of, campaigning in Michigan with 15 electors, giving them all to one party or the other, or another state with 15 electors that divides them, say, proportionally. You get 40% of the vote in the state, you get 40% of those 15 electors. As a candidate, which state would you spend more time campaigning in? Yes, it would be the state that gives all or nothing, because why would you even bother campaigning in the other state that divides them? Because if you're one of the two major parties, you're bound to walk away, even as the loser, with roughly half. So what would be the point? Whereas if you don't bring in Michigan, you lose all 15. So Michigan does it that way because Michigan wants the candidates for president to come to Michigan and promise Michiganders the moon. And giving them all to one party or the other is a way to do that. And in fact, 48 of the 50 states do it just that way. There's only 2 states currently that divide their electors, or conceivably, and those are Nebraska and Maine. Now, how they do it, and in the case of Maine, Maine has 4 electors to the Electoral College. They have 4 electors because they have 2 representatives and they have 2 senators. You add the number of representatives and you add the number of senators, and that's how many electors you get. So how it works in Maine is if you win one House district seat in Maine, you get the elector they get for having that. If you win the other House district seat in Maine, you get the elector they have for having that. And if you win statewide, you get the 2 electors that Maine receives for having 2 senators. And so what that creates is the possibility for a 3-1 split. You couldn't have a 2-2 split. You couldn't win both House district seats and lose statewide. That's mathematically not possible. But you could win one House district and lose the rest of the state, allowing for a 3-1 split. So that is exactly how Maine does it. Nebraska does it the same way, except that Nebraska has 5 electors in the Electoral College. But that's how those 2 states do it. All of the other states, the other 48 states, do it just like Michigan, where it's all or nothing. You get all 15 in this Michigan's case, you get all 15 of its electors this year, or you get nothing. So how does one become an elector? Well, my advice is to join a political party, preferably the Democrat or Republican Party. Prove yourself loyal, and then maybe your party will nominate you to be one of the 15 electors for this state. You see, each party will come up with a slate of nominees before the election. The Democrats will come up with a slate of 15 electors for this state. The Republicans will come up with a list of 15 electoral nominees for this state. The Green Party will come up with 15 nominees to be the electors from this state. The Natural Law Party will come up with 15 nominees to be the electors from this state. The U.S. Taxpayer Party will come up with a list of 15 nominees to be the electors from this state. And whichever party on election day proves to be the most popular, that gets the most votes in Michigan, that party will get all 15 electors to the Electoral College this year. And you might even know one of them if you live here in Grand Rapids, because one of them would have to be from the 3rd Congressional District. So maybe you can find out the names. You don't see the names on the ballot, however. They simply think that that would make the ballot too long, and second of all, they don't think you really care. So all you see on the ballot as a U.S. citizen voter is you just see, this year, Kamala Harris, the Democrat, and Donald Trump, the Republican, and the other minor candidates' choices as well. But if you really wanted to know who the nominees for the electors were for each party, you could contact the Secretary of State's office in Michigan, and they certainly can let you know that on the website or otherwise. It is public information. And those electors are the ones who are going to be chosen next week on Election Day. Now note that the margin of victory for this state doesn't really matter. You win Michigan by 1 million votes, you get all 15 electors. You win Michigan by 5 votes, you get all 15 electors. The margin of victory is really irrelevant. So what that allows, or maybe enhances mathematically, is the possibility, with 48 of the 50 states doing it that way, giving them all to one party or the other, it does create the possibility that one person could win the popular vote and another individual could win the electoral vote and become president. We've certainly seen that happen in recent memory. It happened in 2016, after all, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote for president nationwide, but lost the electoral vote to Donald Trump. And it is the electoral vote that actually matters when it becoming president. Now, I have an example that kind of illustrates that, hopefully, a simplified example. Instead of 50 states, let's assume there's only 2 states. Here you have State A and State B. State A having 1.2 million people, State B having 1 million. I just arbitrarily made up those numbers. And that gives State A the 274 electoral votes, 264 electoral votes for State B. You've got 2 candidates running, Knapp and Pitt. If this is this hypothetical example that I just made up, you look at the popular vote totals, and Pitt is the more popular candidate, winning 1.4 million votes to Knapp's 800,000 votes. So Pitt wins the popular vote in this little scenario, but note that Knapp wins the electoral vote in this scenario. Why? Because Knapp wins State A by a very narrow margin, 700,000 to 500,000, giving him 274 electoral votes. And even though Pitt wins State B by a huge margin, 900,000 to 100,000, giving 264 electoral votes, assuming these states give all their electors to one candidate or the other. That means that Knapp will come out on top with the 274 electoral votes for State A. One candidate winning, in this case Knapp, winning the electoral vote and becoming president, even though the other candidate, Pitt, winning the popular vote. How does this happen? It happens when you have a situation where one candidate wins a certain state, maybe narrowly. In this case, State A. Knapp wins State A 700,000 to 500,000 votes. And it happens when another candidate wins another state by a huge margin. In this case, Pitt winning State B by 900,000 to 100,000. Again, the margin of victory is irrelevant. And so this is what happened in 2016. In 2016, what state was state A, where Donald Trump won the state very narrowly? It was, in fact, Michigan. Donald Trump won Michigan by the narrowest of margins that year. 10,000 votes is all that really separated Donald Trump from Hillary Clinton in 2016. So he won that state. So Michigan was state A, in essence, in that year. In fact, I know a lot of Democrats lament the fact, but the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, actually got more votes than the difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So I guess some might argue that the Green Party alone might have cost Hillary Clinton the state of Michigan in 2016. What state, though, was state B, where Hillary Clinton just wiped the floor with Donald Trump? That would have been like California. Hillary Clinton just destroyed Donald Trump in California. And it partly explains why nationwide, California, you might note, is the most populous state. And it's one reason why Hillary Clinton won the popular vote nationwide by like 3 million votes, even though Donald Trump became president because he won the electoral vote. It is the electoral vote that matters, not the popular vote, much to Hillary Clinton's chagrin that year in 2016. It was not and is not the only time that that has happened. It also happened in 2000. In 2000, the Democrat Al Gore was the more popular candidate nationwide, but George Walker Bush, the Republican, became president because he won the electoral vote that year. And in that year, state A was, in fact, Florida. Florida was the state that George Walker Bush won by the narrowest of margins. In that case, you may remember George Walker Bush won Florida by like 537 votes. A shockingly low number. And yet Al Gore won California, which partly explains why he won the popular vote. It has happened other times too. I mean, you'd have to go back to 1888. In 1876, it's happened. But in 2000, it all came down to Florida. And unfortunately for Al Gore, in part it was due to what was known as the butterfly ballot. It was back when we used punch cards. You'd slid a computer data card in a slot in front of the booklet of the ballot, and then you'd have a little metal stylus that you'd have to punch through a hole to record your vote. We even voted in part that way in Michigan that year. We don't use that method of voting anymore because of the fiasco that occurred. Because what happened there was at least one county that used this butterfly ballot, which some found confusing. Listing the presidential candidates, you'll see here the Republican, George Walker Bush, was the first name on this page. The second name on this page was Al Gore, the Democrat. And even though he's the second name, he is the third hole down because the list of presidential candidates overlaps to the other page. And at the top of the other page, you have Pat Buchanan of the Reform Party. So if you had actually selected the second hole thinking you were voting for Al Gore, you didn't really vote for Al Gore. You actually voted for Pat Buchanan of the Reform Party. And Pat Buchanan got 35,000 votes in, I think this was Palm Beach County. And even he recognizes that, those votes were not intended for him. A lot of people just got confused. But it doesn't matter because you can't go back and take those votes back. That wouldn't be fair to George Walker Bush. So as much as that must have hurt Al Gore to know that, this butterfly ballot would have made the difference in making him president, it's a heartbreaker, but he accepted it, right? Now, obviously, it came down to the Supreme Court. He asked for a recount of the whole state. State Supreme Court of Florida conceded that there should be a recount, a hand recount, but George Walker Bush sued in federal court to stop the hand recount. The U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and awarded the votes for the votes that were showing for George Walker Bush, saying that there wasn't enough time to do a hand recount. So a decision that Al Gore was upset about, but he did end it. You know, he said, "I'm not in favor of the Supreme Court decision, but I respect it." And he said he asked for all his supporters to get behind our new president that year, George Walker Bush, putting himself, actually putting the needs of the country, I guess I should say, in favor of his own personal wants. It happened 2 other times where we had popular candidates lose. 1888, Benjamin Harrison won the electoral vote, even though Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, was the more popular choice that year. It also happened in 1876 when Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, won the electoral vote, even though Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, was far more popular. And in fact, that year, Rutherford B. Hayes only won the electoral vote by one vote. One electoral vote is all that made the difference. It also happened in 1824, but for reasons I'll explain later, that year deserves an asterisk, where John Quincy Adams defeated Andrew Jackson and became president. If you look at the year of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, a lot of the disputed ballots, not all of them, but some of them were in Florida. So once again, Florida was at the top of the headlines. And what happened that year, it was really Congress that ended up allocating the electors and settling it, not the Supreme Court that year anyway. Now, we will choose the electors next week in November on Election Day, and your choice will be for which electors for which party. Again, you're indirectly choosing the President of the United States, not directly choosing the President. You're choosing electors who are going to then vote for President themselves. Now, those 15 electors for Michigan are not the senators and representatives. They are 15 other people. And even though we will choose the electors in November, the electors themselves don't vote for another 6 weeks in December. So how is it that we can pronounce a winner, as we usually do in November, even though the electors themselves will not have voted for another 6 weeks in December? Well, the reason the media does that is because they know how the system works. They know who wins, which party wins the electors for which state, and they are just simply assuming, they're assuming that all the Democratic electors are going to vote for the Democratic candidate, and they're assuming that all the Republican electors are going to vote for the Republican candidate. And I think that is a generally safe assumption myself, but it is an assumption nonetheless. They are assuming. The electors won't vote again for another 6 weeks. And it is the case that sometimes you have what is known as a faithless elector. Sometimes an elector votes for someone other than who they promised to vote for. The term for that is a faithless elector. It's certainly happened throughout history. Not many, but has happened. In Michigan, well, actually it wasn't just in Michigan, but in 1976, Michigan's favorite son, Gerald Ford, here in Grand Rapids, was running for election in his own right. He was the sitting president, and he was facing the Democrat Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter would end up winning that election. Jimmy Carter, who just turned 100 this last month. But one of Ford's Republican electors did not vote for Gerald Ford. One of his Republican electors voted for another Republican by the name of Ronald Reagan. So if you look it up, Ronald Reagan got one electoral vote in 1976. Now, Ronald Reagan wasn't even on the ballot because Ronald Reagan had challenged Gerald Ford for the nomination, but he did not win that challenge. It was Ford who was nominated. But obviously, at least one Republican felt that that was a bad choice and that Ronald Reagan should have been the president, because Ronald Reagan got one electoral vote that year. Ronald Reagan would have to wait another 4 years before becoming president after the 1980 election. Now, although it is rare for an elector not to vote for who they promised to vote for, it does happen on occasion. Another example would have been in 2004, the Democrat John Kerry, one of his electors, when he was running against George Walker Bush, one of John Kerry's electors voted for John Edwards. So John Edwards, his vice presidential running mate, got one electoral vote for president. You know, up until 2016, every faithless elector had always counted. Although throughout our history, no faithless electors have ever cost anybody the election. I mean, theoretically, it's possible, but we've never had enough faithless electors that anyone has ever cost them the presidency. In 2016, we had the most faithless electors we'd ever had. We had 7 in 2016. And it still didn't matter. Hillary Clinton, it wouldn't have made any of the difference for Hillary Clinton. It wouldn't have made the difference. Now, we did have Horace Greeley back in the 19th century who lost to Ulysses S. Grant. But Horace Greeley, he died right after Election Day that fall. And so he died before the electors actually voted. So you had a lot of his electors voted for another candidate, but we don't consider them faithless because, well, after all, he was dead. Although some of them still voted for him. Now, the electors themselves, they vote in December, and then those electoral votes are counted before a joint session of Congress in January. January 6th, as a matter of fact, a date that should be burned in our memory by now. It's not a date that most people used to know, but of course now we know, considering what happened last time. Now, on January 6th, it is the Congress meets in joint session. The president of the Senate, which is always the vice president of the United States, is the one who opens the ballots and officially declares the winner. Now, how many electors do you need to win the presidency? The Electoral College is actually one example of a majority election. In fact, you need a majority of the Electoral College to become president. And a majority of 538, which is the total number of electors, is actually 270. That's one more than half, which would be 269. So that is why all the presidential candidates are looking at how can they get 270 electoral votes, because they know they need a majority to win. If there's no majority, then nobody wins the Electoral College vote, in which case what happens? Well, if nobody wins a majority in the Electoral College, then the election goes to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, according to the Constitution, then selects the president from the top 3 finishers in the Electoral College. Has that ever happened? Yes, it has in fact happened. It's happened twice, actually. One of them was 1824. In 1824, I mentioned you had Andrew Jackson running for president. He was the most popular candidate. He got the most electoral votes, but he did not get a majority in the Electoral College. So the House of Representatives had to pick amongst the top 3 electoral finishers, and they did not pick Andrew Jackson. They actually picked John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. So John Quincy Adams became president out of the 1824 election. Andrew Jackson was kind of upset about it, but he would have to wait another 4 years before he would win the presidency on his own. Now, it happened earlier than that in 1800, but 1800 also deserves an asterisk because the Electoral College functioned a little differently then. In 1800, how it worked is you had to have, each elector voted twice for president. 2 different people. You could vote for 2 people as an elector for president. And then whoever came in second in the Electoral College vote became vice president. We don't do it that way anymore. and for the following reason, actually. What happened was in 1800, you had John Adams, who was the current sitting president, running against Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson's running mate was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was meant to be vice president. He was the same man who ended up shooting Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel. One of Aaron Burr's electors, was not supposed to vote for Aaron Burr, so that Aaron Burr would intentionally come in second and become vice president. But what happened is they got confused, and what Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson ended up tying in the Electoral College, which meant there was no winner, and then the House of Representatives had to select the winner. And they ended up selecting Thomas Jefferson. So it ended up working out in his favor. But we quickly changed the Constitution after that to make sure that that fiasco would never occur again. And we got the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment specifies that electors now they don't get two choices for president. They get one choice for president, and they get one choice for vice president. And they have to specify which is which. No more confusing the issue there. So the 1800 election mess has been remedied. Now, the electors not only choose the president, but they also choose the vice president. And the vice president needs a majority in the Electoral College as well. Now, what happens if no one gets a majority for vice president in the Electoral College? Well, then the Constitution says that the Senate selects the vice president. And they will choose amongst the top two finishers in the Electoral College for vice president. Has that ever happened? And the answer is yes, that has happened too. You have to go back to 1836, though, for that. Martin Van Buren won the presidency that year in 1836, but his vice presidential running mate, Richard Johnson, did not get a majority in the Electoral College. He, in fact, he didn't get a majority, and then the Senate had to select him. And they did. The reason he didn't get a majority in the Electoral College was in part because of his scandalous relationship considered by many. His common law wife was his slave by the name of Julia and fathered him several children. And she was an octoroon, meaning she was 1/8 black, which certainly made her eligible to be a slave, but he also made her his wife. And there was a lot of Americans at that racist time. It was, as common as the practice might have been, siring children with your slaves, that was not something that was acceptable to be public about. And that was one reason why the Senate had to pick the vice president that year, the last time that happened. So note that the electors themselves, when they vote, they don't vote with the same ballot that you and I get. You know, we have to choose our president and vice president preference together as a team. You know, the electors just get a ballot with one line, and they can put in anybody's name for president, and then same for vice president, and they have to specify which is which. So the two times that the House of Representatives had to choose the president so far, 1824 and 1800. People thought it was going to happen actually in 1992. In 1992, you had an interesting situation with George Bush Sr. running for re-election, the Republican, running against the Democrat, Bill Clinton, and then this third guy by the name of Ross Perot running as an independent who was immensely popular. And people thought, wow, tight three-way race. We may not get a majority of the Electoral College, and the House might have to choose. There was a lot of talk that year about it, but it didn't end up happening, mainly because Ross Perot turned out to be kind of a flake. He dropped out of the race at the end of August, and then changed his mind again and jumped back in the race like in the end of September. And by then, a lot of his support had gone away, but he still ended up getting 20% of the popular vote nationwide, which was it's a record for any independent candidate. However, he didn't win enough votes in any one state to carry any electors. So he got 0 electors in the Electoral College, and we know that Bill Clinton ended up winning the presidency that year. And so, yeah, and so 1836, the year that Richard Johnson had to be chosen by the Senate because no majority for him in the Electoral College. Now, I think this map I like this map. It's distorted. It's a distorted map of the United States. And it shows you the more electors a state has, the more, the larger that state appears on the map. That's why I find it useful, right? So at a glance, you can easily look at this map and see which are the most important states in the Electoral College as far as having the most electors. California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, but Michigan, not a too shabby 15 electors. Some states, as little as 3, right? 3 is the minimum that any state can have because every state has at least one representative, no matter how small the population. And every state has 2 senators, so you can't have any fewer than 3. By all rights, Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, probably doesn't even deserve 3 electors if you look at its population purely, but population solely doesn't determine the number of electors. You also have to take into account the senators that your state has. Note that the House and Senate members are not the electors themselves. The electors are completely different people. So some might look at that and say, well, Wyoming is overrepresented in the Electoral College because it only has like 600,000 people, fewer than it might otherwise deserve. But on the other hand, you might say that Wyoming's citizens' votes are not maybe as important as Michigan's or even California's. Certainly the candidates think would much rather have Michigan's, your vote here in Michigan than in Wyoming, although in a close election, mind you, all electors matter. I mean, we don't know how close potential elections are going to be. This map is a little interesting. It's a little dated, but it shows you that some of the states with the fewest number of electors have some of the highest turnout, at least in the 1980s. And I find that a little interesting. In the 2012 presidential election, this map shows you in red the number of the states that Mitt Romney won, the Republican, and Barack Obama actually won re-election. He was the Democrat that year, and those states supporting him are in blue. So we talk about blue states and red states now because map makers kind of just got in the habit of showing Republican states in red and Democratic states in blue. It's really just a historical accident. There's no reason why the Democrats had to be blue, but we now refer to blue states as being supportive of the Democratic Party or red states supportive of the Republican Party. And this was certainly a more typical election as they existed before the Trump era. In 2016, we had more faithless electors than we ever had. Now, you can't count Maine, though, because Maine split their electors as they typically do. That wasn't a faithless elector. But you did have 7 faithless electors who didn't vote for who they promised to vote for. 2 Republican electors from Texas did not vote for who they promised to vote. They didn't vote for Donald Trump. One of them voted for John Kasich, who was the Republican governor from Ohio who challenged Trump for the nomination and obviously lost. But this elector obviously wanted him to be president. So Kasich got 1 electoral vote. The other electoral vote from Texas went to Ron Paul, who was a former Republican congressman from Texas. You may be more familiar with his son, Rand Paul, who's a sitting U.S. senator. But anyway, Ron Paul got 1 electoral vote that year. And then, surprisingly, the Democrats had more faithless electors than the Republicans that year. They had 5 faithless electors. One of the Democratic electors from Hawaii didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, but instead voted for Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders got 1 electoral vote in 2016. 4 of the Democratic electors from Washington voted for somebody else other than Hillary Clinton. 3 of them, ironically, voted for a Republican, Colin Powell. Colin Powell, former retired general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at one point, Secretary of Defense at one point under President Bush. So that was kind of odd. Now, he had actually endorsed Barack Obama at one point, and I think he endorsed Hillary Clinton that year, so maybe that explained that. The other elector from Washington that was faithless voted for a Native American by the name of Spotted Eagle. So Spotted Eagle got one electoral vote that year as well. So we saw a record number of electors. These 7 would not have cost Hillary Clinton the electoral vote. There was a few others, but they were ruled out because they came from, well, not Michigan, but states like Michigan. Michigan has a law, if you don't know, that bans its electors from voting for anybody other than who they promised to vote for. So Michigan's law does not allow faithless electors, but we never really knew if that law would be constitutional or would stand up in court until the 2016 election. Before the 2016 election, no faithless elector had ever been rejected. In 2016, that happened. There were other states who had equally banned their electors from being faithless. It was challenged and went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld states like Michigan and said that states did have the right to bind their electors. I think I agreed with the ruling, but I found it amusing that it was by a conservative court that claimed to be originalist when the founders of our Constitution seemed to indicated that they wanted the electors to be free agents. But that is not the way the Supreme Court interpreted that, the Constitution, and allowed Michigan. So we won't have any faithless electors in Michigan. And I think there's about 30 states or so that bind their electors in that way. But that leaves a few other states that don't. And so we may end up with faithless electors even this year. So we'll have to stay tuned. But like I said, up until now, no faithless elector had ever cost anybody the presidency. But I guess theoretically that could change. If we look at the 2020 election, and by the way, in the 2016 election, the reason why Hillary Clinton lost it is because she lost 3 previously reliably Democratic states: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Michigan was the closest. Hillary Clinton only lost Michigan by 10,000 votes. But all 3 states were lost by Hillary Clinton by only a total of 100,000 votes. So, I mean, it was just such a squeaker that Donald Trump was able to throw that, pull that inside straight and win the Electoral College vote that year. Consequently, in 2020, Joe Biden, who was the Democratic candidate, knew that he had to reverse that. He had to flip those 3 states back to the Democratic column, and then he knew that he would secure the election. That would give him the 270 needed. So keep all the states that he had before, or that the Democrats had before, flip those 3 states back, which is what he did, and that's what made him president. However, he also got an added bonus in adding Georgia from red to blue and Arizona from red to blue. And so he got more states than was needed. And Donald Trump, of course, alleged fraud, and his allegations of fraud were heard in all the federal courts, and they were all thrown out. Basically, the courts, even the Supreme Court, refused to hear it. There was just not enough. There was not enough evidence of fraud on a scale that would have cost him any of those states. And so that is why Donald Trump is really lying when he said that he won the election when he didn't. He didn't win. It's a lie. It's unfortunate that he's perpetuated that lie to many of his supporters and followers. After Joe Biden was declared, was found to be the winner, and I think it was like the Saturday after the election that the media finally was able to make that pronouncement. Then Donald Trump pursued his legal challenges. When that didn't work, he leaned on Mike Pence. Mike Pence, as president of the Senate, he thought could discount some of the ballots from some of the states, and he tried to confuse the issue. Republicans even had fake electors from Michigan. We had 16 electors that year. The Democrats won them in 2020. But 16 Republican electors showed up at the state capitol claiming to be the rightful electors. And when they weren't let in, they proceeded to vote illegally on fake electoral ballots. And they submitted those to the U.S. Capitol in the hopes that it would confuse the issue and that Congress could take the initiative to disqualify some of the states so that no one would have a majority in the Electoral College, and then the House would have to choose the president. That was the plan. The Republicans knew that given the new House of Representatives that was elected, that they would have a majority in the House and that they could choose Donald Trump. By the way, when the House has to choose the president, they don't vote, each of the representatives don't vote individually. They vote as a block per state. So each state, in effect, gets one vote. And how they would figure it is they just simply see which party had a majority of that state's representatives. They would be the ones to determine how Michigan, in this case, would vote. And you needed a majority of the 50 states. So you would, and the Republicans, as it worked out, would have had 26 states to make that confirmation and make Donald Trump the president if enough ballots could be thrown out to prevent, enough electoral ballots, to prevent anyone from having a majority in the Electoral College. That was indeed the plan. Mike Pence who's responsible for that plan being foiled. He's the only one that stopped that from working. He said, as much as he would have liked to see Donald Trump and himself reelected, he told Donald Trump, "You lost this election." And he said, I'm going to walk in there, I'm going to count the ballots as they are, and I'm going to certify Joe Biden president. And Donald Trump's response to Mike Pence was, "Mike, you're too honest. You're too honest." And so Donald Trump's plan then was to put a lot of pressure on Mike Pence, as well as the other Republicans in Congress, to go through with what he had planned. And for that reason, he called the rally on January 6th at the Capitol. He gave the speech at the Ellipse, called his supporters from all over. They were all there to put pressure on Mike Pence. Donald Trump said at the speech, "Mike Pence has betrayed us. He's let us down." It's one reason why all of his supporters, Donald Trump supporters, were yelling, "Hang Mike Pence," when they did end up entering the Capitol. Some of those supporters were armed with weapons. Donald Trump was informed of that. He said, "I don't care. They're not here to harm me. Let them through the magnetometers. Let them through anyway." His plan was to march with them to the Capitol. That didn't end up happening because the Secret Service did not find it was safe, and they would not allow him to go to the Capitol. So his marchers, his rally supporters, went there on their own, where they proceeded to sack the Capitol. And of course, over 100 police officers were injured. Some of them lost fingers. Some died like the next day. We can only speculate as to how much the riot had to do with that. At least one of the individuals who died of a heart attack the next day was pepper sprayed or bear sprayed. Took bear spray to the face the day before. That might have had something to do with it. We do know that one of the protesters, the ralliers, was Ashley Babbitt. She was shot dead trying to enter the chamber. In the meantime, some of those Trump rally supporters defecated in the Capitol, smeared their feces over the walls. Certainly a black mark on American history. The congressmen inside had to flee for their lives. Even Mike Pence, who had the ire of the crowd, they actually erected a gallows outside as they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." He was spirited to the parking garage where the Secret Service was attempting. They wanted him to get in the car, the bulletproof limo, and evacuate him because of the danger. Many Secret Service agents were calling their families, thinking that they were going to die that day. Mike Pence wouldn't get in the car. His Secret Service agent told him, "Mike, you know me, you can trust me." And he's like, "Yeah, I trust you, but I don't trust the driver." He didn't trust the other Secret Service agents because he thought they might be in on the plot. He said, "I'm not getting in that car and having you drive me away. I'm going to stay here in the Capitol and perform my constitutional duty and certify Joe Biden President of the United States," which he did. albeit he had to wait till the next day. It wasn't until the riot, the 4 hours before assistance arrived, Donald Trump sitting in the White House watching the TV, gleefully impressed that his followers would be willing to commit such acts in his favor. Help finally arrived to clear the Capitol, secure it so that the congressmen could come back in and perform their duty. It would not actually be performed until the next day, January 7th. This is, of course, part of the reason why Donald Trump is being charged under federal law, and also his leaning on the Secretary of State in Georgia, trying to get Georgia to overturn its electoral vote, is another reason why he's facing charges. Now, Donald Trump alleged that he made all kinds of allegations about fraud in Georgia. He said there was 10,000 dead people that voted. There was actually, according to Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, there was less than 5. He said that thousands of felons voted illegally when, according to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, the Republican, less than 74. And of course, he alleged that 60,000 underage voters voted. There was actually 0 of that. Donald Trump lost Georgia in 2020 by only 11,779 votes, and which is one reason why Donald Trump called Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, wanting him to find 11,780 votes, the exact number that he needed to win. He wasn't worried about fraud in general. Just enough votes is all he wanted to win, which is one reason why he's being charged in the state of Georgia for overturning that state's election. Georgia was one of the states that he was hoping that the electoral ballots would be discounted. Now, on January 6th, when the congressmen went back in the Capitol, a majority of the Republican delegation from the House did vote to disqualify certain ballots, but that was not enough. There was enough Republicans added with the Democrats to prevent that from happening. On January 6, 2021, Joe Biden was indeed certified president and the winner of the election, and the House did not end up choosing the president that year. Which really brings us to the current election. And my prediction is that the Republicans are prepared to run that same play again. Now, if Donald Trump wins the election next week, entirely possible. The polls are so close. We don't know if the polls are accurate. We don't know who's going to win. But if Donald Trump loses, and my prediction is that he will try to run the same play. If he wins, I predict that he'll win the electoral vote, but still lose the popular vote as he did in 2016. But we'll see if that happens. If he loses, he'll probably have court challenges. He's going to try to encourage chaos in the hopes that certain electoral ballots will be discounted when it comes time for the Congress to count them. We'll see if that works. The Congress has passed an Electoral Count Act to strengthen. Now, back in 2020, you needed only 1 representative and 1 senator to call into question any state's ballots. But now, with the new Electoral Count Act, you need 20% of the House and 20% of the Senate to challenge any such ballots. But the Republicans have enough support. Maybe they can still pull it off. Now, Republicans had tried to win in court the idea of the independent state legislature theory. They were arguing that state legislatures should be able to overturn the popular votes of the people and just award the electors based on what the state legislature would like. Now, that theory was thrown out by the Supreme Court in a case known as Moore versus Harper in 2023. The Supreme Court said that no, legislatures they're not all powerful when it comes to awarding the electors. The executive and the judicial branches in the various states also have a role to play in elections, and it can't just be whatever the legislature wants. So the idea that legislatures could just dictatorially overrule the will of the voters and assign electors was overturned by the Supreme Court in that decision. The Electoral Count Act of the updated Act of 2022, as I said, makes it a little bit harder for challenges to occur in the Congress. It also specifies that the vice president's role is solely ministerial. The vice president has no decision-making capacity in and of himself. Remember, the vice president is also the president of the Senate, and in that role, or currently that would be Kamala Harris. She wouldn't be able to just disqualify or say which ballots count and which ones can't. The states now determine when the electors must be certified, and the governors send the certified electors to Congress. Now, it's entirely possible that governors might choose to send the wrong electors, and then in which case we might have a real possibility for disruption in this election. Other possibilities are, of course, the lawsuits that Donald Trump might bring. Also, canvassing boards may refuse to certify the local vote count. That might create a constitutional crisis. And then, of course, finally, the majority of Congress may object to the electoral votes as not regularly given or lawfully certified, as quoting the law. Now, what does regularly given and lawfully certified mean? I'm not a lawyer, but I have no idea how that could be interpreted. So that is a potential weak spot, I think, in the law. So we'll have to see if that occurs. The dates to look for coming up, of course, is the election day, November 5th, when you, the voters, will decide which electors this state should to go to which party for this state. And of course, the states themselves have different deadlines for certifying their own votes for the electors, but the electors themselves are required by federal law to be certified by December 11th. They will actually vote on December 17th this year. And those I should say the new Congress will be sworn in on January 3rd. So it is the new Congress that actually will have to settle any disputes. On January 6th, that new Congress, and we don't know which party will control the House or the Senate, that's all to be determined. They will open up the ballots. The ballots will be counted by the President of the Senate and then certified, and the new president proclaimed. And of course, the new president will be sworn in on January 20th. And even if the election is thrown into the House of Representatives and the House of Representatives has to pick a president, if they haven't picked one by Inauguration Day, Joe Biden's term still ends that day. His term expires no matter whether we have a new president or not. And should we have a new vice president, the new vice president will become the acting president until the House of Representatives actually settles on a choice. And remember, they have to vote by state in the House of Representatives, each state getting one vote, and there has to be a majority. And they just keep voting until they get one, should it come to that. Well, anyway, there's about 7 states that the polls are really tight in that are hard to predict. Michigan is one of them. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are the states to watch. Of course, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and maybe Nevada. So watch those 7 states on election night to give us an indicator of who is going to be our next president. And at this point, it's too close to call. I do not know how it's going to go down next week. So it's certainly not boring. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming, and make sure you vote. Thank you.